It's time for Global Insight. Britain and the world continue to mourn Queen Elizabeth II, who passed away on Thursday at the age of 96. The oldest-serving British monarch, whose Platinum Jubilee was celebrated just months ago, has been looked to as a rare constant in the lives of many, a steadying figure who inspired calm and dignity in the rapidly changing post-war world. Her son, the Prince of Wales, has become King Charles III, and in his first address to Parliament, the new monarch said he would follow in his mother's footsteps of selfish duty to the nation with loyalty, respect and love. As the world grieves her death and marking the end of the second Elizabethan era, we pay tribute to the legacy of her late Majesty the Queen and discuss what's ahead for her successor. For this, we're joined by David Tizzard, Professor of Korean Studies at Seoul Women's National University. Very warm welcome to you, David.
Good morning. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. And, well, it seems that time has somewhat come to a standstill in Britain at the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. And, well, how is Britain really processing this loss? What did the Queen mean to the British people?
The Queen obviously meant a great deal. I think she symbolised the nation in many, many ways. You touched on one word there just in your introduction, which was continuity. And I would just like to try to explain why that continuity was so important to Queen Elizabeth II. As she grew up, she saw her uncle, Edward VIII. He abdicated. He left the throne after less than a year on the throne, and so for Queen Elizabeth II, this was something that she didn't want to repeat. She believed that the monarch had a duty to remain a steadfast symbol, to remain something that would always be there for the British people, and didn't want to discredit, let's say, the throne by walking away from it. And that's why, despite any conversations, despite any questions about her health, despite even her son ascending to the throne now as King Charles III, as the oldest monarch to take the throne, he's now in his 70s, Queen Elizabeth was never going to walk away. And I think for many people in the United Kingdom and perhaps around the world as well, she did represent that symbol of continuity, of steadfastness, and perhaps, as we might say, a little bit of a stiff British upper lip in the face of great adversity and change.
Right, and David, the Queen, she was on the throne for most of the post-war era up to this, now what we call the fourth industrial era. And, well, what were some of the many key moments that the Queen provided this calmness and this sense of keeping calm and carrying on amid very difficult times?
When we have democracies and democratic governments, we see dramatic shifts between the left and the right. We see governments rise and fall, and we also see figures of great political influence come and dominate the political scene. In the United Kingdom, this might have been Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and then a little bit later in the 90s with the rise of New Labour and Cool Britannia under Prime Minister Tony Blair, when Britain sort of regained a sense of confidence in its cultural outputs, with not BTS or Blackpink, but Blur and Oasis dominating international charts, and movies like Notting Hill, Four Weddings and a Funeral receiving international acclaim. But also then, during this last 2 decades, where Britain's role in the international world has diminished somewhat, Queen Elizabeth II was there for all of that. And I think that's perhaps one of the advantages of a constitutional monarchy, in that where politicians will always be subject to the warp and woof these days, more than ever with social media and that intense scrutiny on their private lives, on their morals and such forth. Through all of the ups and downs, Queen Elizabeth was there. I have seen some royal historians and biographers who are saying that in 100 years, when we look back on this second Elizabethan era, it will be seen as an era of decline. And now let's be clear, that's not because of Queen Elizabeth II, but rather Britain's role in the world over the last 70 years or so has diminished from what it once was. And that's natural in the rise and fall of nations. But despite that slight declining in global influence, I believe she was able to still provide confidence and a sense of meaning and being to the British people and others around the world.
And as you said, well, despite this diminishing influence of the nation itself, it's really hard to think of a monarch as globally known and respected like the British Queen was. And what do you think really made her so prominent internationally? What does she really represent to the world?
It's a very difficult question because I think she means different things to different people. And so, for example, what Queen Elizabeth II might mean to me might be very different from you, and it might be very different from some people in the Commonwealth countries. I was listening to the French president, President Macron, give his speech, a very touching and moving speech in commemoration of Queen Elizabeth II's passing. And in that speech, President Macron said to the British people, he was your queen, but to the people of France, he was just the queen. If there are queens around the world, and there have been queens in history, but Queen Elizabeth II, she seemed to encapsulate the role of queen itself. In a sense, maybe this is a little bit of too much of a British perspective, but she seemed like the queen, not just a queen, of which she was, of course, internationally. She did that for a continuity. You asked what did she mean to people around the world. Just for the sake of balance, we should say that some people have seen her as perhaps a symbol of a more traditional time in which monarchs did rule the world, and other people favored different democratic systems or republican systems in which monarchies don't play a role. So she did mean a lot of things to many people. Most of those, I believe, were positive, but of course she did represent other things to other people as well.
Well, the Queen, she was actually on the throne for as long as the Korean War. And, well, in that sense, she's been a constant over the decades to the Korean people too. And, of course, she visited the country in 1999. Well, what was the lasting impression that she really left on the country?
In my interaction with Korean people here over the last 2 decades, I've often received, warm observations about not only Queen Elizabeth II, but the royal family in general, Buckingham Palace, and the symbols that resonate out from that. Very interestingly, when the Queen did visit South Korea in 1999, one of the people that organized that tour and was part of that was Colin Crooks. Now, Colin Crooks is the current ambassador of the United Kingdom to the Republic of Korea, and over the last few days on social media, he's been leading the commemorations of her life and also the mourning that takes place. He's able to do this amazingly in both English but in fluent Korean as well, and I really think that helps bridge the gaps between the two countries. At the British Embassy from today, there is a book of mourning and commemoration that's been opened by the British Embassy, where people can go and write down goodwill messages, condolences, and even personal reflections. So I think currently the British Embassy, the current ambassador Colin Crooks, they're doing really important things to keep that bond between the two countries steady, which, as you say, was created not just in the Korean War, but certainly solidified by those people standing shoulder to shoulder on the battlefield.
And well, although the nation is, of course, still grieving, her son, King Charles III, he is now the ruling monarch of Britain. And well, how do you think he's going to really conduct his engagements overseas?
This is something everybody is waiting to see. At the start of this conversation, I told you that Queen Elizabeth II, how she approached the role was greatly influenced, maybe not necessarily by her personal desires, but by her experiences with her uncle and what she saw before that. Now, as King Charles III, the ruling monarch of the United Kingdom and 14 Commonwealth countries, I'll come to that, it will be interesting to see how much of his own personal character and personality he puts into the role, or how much he goes into the title and position of king and plays the role of that titular figure. That will be very interesting to see. Now, you mentioned, or you asked about his overseas activities. King Charles III, he faced an assassination attempt in Australia in 1994. Perhaps more positively, in 1995, he was the first member of the ruling family to visit Ireland in an official capacity. And then in 1997, here in Asia, when Britain handed Hong Kong back to China, it was then Prince Charles who was there representing the throne in that handover back to Beijing. So he's had a big role in international affairs. But what I think we'll see now with King Charles III coming to the throne, we're going to see many of those 14 Commonwealth states around the world reconsider their position and ask questions. Is it time to change? Is there time for a Republican change? They will be very fraught conversations, because there will people on both sides with both their points to be made. But that's the situation that King Charles III is going to inherit, and it will be interesting to see how he navigates through these waters.
Right, and well, the royal family, it's been through some tumultuous times over the past 3 decades, during which British public opinion has become less favourable towards them generally. And the Queen was, she was very much deemed the central figure that glued everyone together. And do you think this sort of anti-monarch sentiment is going to grow stronger? How do you think the Windsors are really adapting to the times and these sort of changes in opinion?
I think the royal family, they've done their best to adapt. But let's remember, when we talk about the Queen and we talk about the King, when we talk about princes, there we're talking about roles. We're talking about symbols, and we're talking about caricatures. But the royal family are also individuals. They're humans, and just like any family around the world, they have their problems. They have those that lead better lives than others. They have those with various difficulties. So what they represent, 2 things at the same time. They represent these symbols and these characters, but at the same time, they're people. Navigating that has been very difficult. We've seen many controversies come to light about certain members of the royal family. Few of those, if any, affected Queen Elizabeth II from a personal basis. She seemed very steadfast and upright in her character and the way she presented herself, and that is really to her credit. The world that we inhabit today, you described it as the 4th Industrial Revolution. We live in a world of flux and change. That once solid modernity is turning to liquid, and now we're becoming a more secular age. Whether this is good or bad, we're going to navigate it somehow. But where once we had symbols of religious symbols and pomp and majesty, those things seem to be disappearing from us around many places. And so how they navigate this will be interesting. In 100 years, will we still have royal families? And if we do or don't, will that be a good thing? If we lose them, what will we miss? If we gain them, what will we have? I think this is a conversation for people all around the world. Briefly, I'd just like to make one last point, is that many times these constitutional monarchs are associated with very traditional, very conservative and very backward ways of life. If you look on a global scale, some of the countries with the most progressive values and attitudes towards gender, towards the LGBT community, towards social welfare, towards immigration, they take place in constitutional monarchies like those that you see in Western and Northern Europe. So I think there is still a role for them in the world if we want them to be.
And on that note, how do you think King Charles III is really going to rule? Do you think he's going to mostly keep with tradition, or do you think he's going to conduct his duties somewhat differently?
This is the big unknown, because while much of what is taking place at the moment has been known for years, if not decades, the ceremonies, the funerals, the hymns that will be sung, all the majesty and the pomp, that's been put in place for a long time as people have prepared for this. But more importantly, the unknowns are: how will the British and the global international community react to this changing? And then also, what will King Charles III do in his position? Because before this, he's been a very active and outspoken person. There have been some criticisms that he's been a little bit too forceful and that he should adopt a more symbolic and constitutional position. Yet it seems, and of course I don't know King Charles III personally, but from reading about him, from those that do, he believes he's in a position to try to make the world a better place. He wants to try to impart goodness on the world, and that will be a difficult thing if he's dealing with his own personal beliefs and then his role of king. How will he go through that? That's going to be fascinating to see, because what he wants personally and perhaps what the British public want or expect, there might be a little bit of conflict there. So it will be interesting to see over the next few years how he adapts to that role.
Right, and well, the royal family is not just a family, but it's an organisation, really. And well, with the Prince of Wales now having become the King of England, what does this mean for Prince William and Kate?
I think for Prince William, he becomes the heir apparent, and that's a new role he will have to adopt, and there will be a lot of focus on him. We saw how King Charles III often became somewhat a figure of comedic interest in how he had to wait for so long to assume the throne, one of the longest ever heir apparents in history. And as I said, that was because Queen Elizabeth II, irrespective of the situation, was not going to give up the throne, not for personal selfish desires, but because continuity, she believed, was important and didn't want to repeat what her uncle had done. For Prince William and Kate, their position will now change in a little bit. There will be more focus on them now, not just as princes, such forth, but as the heir apparent, as the person that will come next. And if King Charles III is, I believe, 73, those conversations will become more and more serious as the years go, and they will become under more public scrutiny. There will be more focus on their public lives, their personal lives, their family, their relationships. They'll feel a great pressure, I believe, to maintain at least an outward appearance of a happy family, of a relationship that doesn't contemplate divorce or separation. In our modern world, we see things such as divorce and going your own way as positive and as of development. But do we also accept and do we expect those of our royal families as well, or do they live to different standards from the rest of us? I think that's a kind of interesting conversation.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up here, but thank you very much for joining us. David Tizzard, Professor of Korean Studies at Seoul University. Thank you again for your time today.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you.